At my daughter-in-law's baby shower, she slapped me in public and said, "Useless old woman, clean the floor and go take care of the kids." While they laughed, I left in silence and made a call. Half an hour later, when the door opened, everyone turned pale. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I stood in the doorway of Aurora's perfectly decorated living room, clutching the gift bag containing the hand-knitted baby blanket I'd spent 3 weeks making. The soft yellow yarn had been chosen carefully, gender-neutral and warm, each stitch woven with the love I felt for my future grandchild. I'd imagined this moment so many times, picturing Aurora's surprised smile when she opened it, maybe even a thank you hug. How naive I was. The baby shower was in full swing. 20-something women sat in a circle, their designer handbags arranged like trophies around their chairs. I recognized some faces from previous family gatherings, though none had ever made much effort to include me in their conversations. Aurora held court in the center, her pregnant belly prominently displayed in a form-fitting dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. "Martha, you're finally here," Aurora said without looking up from the mountain of gifts surrounding her. Her tone suggested I was late, though I'd arrived exactly when she'd told me to come. "The kitchen needs cleaning up. Some of the ladies spilled wine on the counter." I felt my cheeks burn, but I nodded. This wasn't unusual. At every family gathering for the past 3 years, since my son David married Aurora, I'd somehow become the unofficial help. I told myself it was just Aurora's way of making sure I felt useful, included in the preparations. I made my way to the kitchen, past the group of laughing women who barely acknowledged my presence. The counter was indeed messy. Sticky rings from wine glasses and crumbs from the elaborate catered appetizers scattered across the marble surface. I found a dish rag and began wiping, listening to the animated chatter from the living room. "Aurora, this stroller is gorgeous. It must have cost $800, someone exclaimed. "Actually, it was $1,200, Aurora replied with obvious pride. "David insisted we get the best for our little prince." I smiled despite myself. David had always been generous, even as a child. He'd saved his allowance for weeks to buy me a Mother's Day card when he was 8 years old. Now he was providing well for his growing family, and I was proud of him. "Martha, we need more champagne," Aurora called from the living room. "And bring some napkins." Someone dropped cake on the carpet. I opened 3 more bottles, arranging them on a silver tray Aurora had received as a wedding gift. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, and I had to concentrate to avoid dropping anything. At 61, I wasn't as quick as I'd been during my working years, but I managed just fine living independently in my small apartment across town. When I returned to the living room with the champagne, the gift opening was in full swing. Aurora had unwrapped a designer diaper bag, a set of organic baby bottles, and what looked like enough baby clothes to dress triplets. Each gift was greeted with squeals of delight and comments about how lucky the baby would be. I waited for a pause in the festivities, then stepped forward with my gift bag. "Aurora, I made something special for the baby." The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to me. Aurora looked at the simple paper bag in my hands with barely concealed disdain. "Oh, how thoughtful." I pulled out the yellow blanket, holding it up so everyone could see the intricate pattern I'd chosen. Cable knit with tiny sheep along the border. It had taken me hours each evening, working by the light of my reading lamp. "I thought he might like something handmade. It's machine washable, and the yarn is hypoallergenic." Several women exchanged glances. One of them, a blonde whose name I'd never learned, whispered something to her neighbor that made them both smirk. Aurora took the blanket from my hands, examining it like she was inspecting a piece of suspect produce. "It's very yellow." "Yellow is perfect for babies," I said, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. "And I can make another one in blue once he's born if you'd like." Aurora set the blanket aside, not with the other opened gifts, but on an empty chair away from the display. "Martha, could you clean up this wrapping paper? It's getting everywhere." I bent down to gather the discarded ribbons and tissue paper, my knees protesting. Behind me, Aurora had moved on to the next gift, a high-tech baby monitor that connected to your phone. The excitement in her voice as she examined it was noticeably different from her reaction to my blanket. "This is amazing. Now I can check on him from anywhere in the house. Technology is just incredible these days." As I stuffed wrapping paper into a garbage bag, I heard one of the guests ask, "Aurora, will your mother-in-law be helping with babysitting?" The question made me freeze. I'd been hoping Aurora might want my help after the baby arrived. I'd raised David on my own after his father left when David was just 5 years old. I knew about sleepless nights and teething and the 1,000 little things new parents worry about. Aurora's laugh was sharp, artificial. "Oh, I don't think that would work out. Martha means well, but she's not really equipped for modern childcare. She still thinks you can put honey in baby bottles and let them sleep on their stomachs." Heat rushed to my face. I'd never suggested either of those things. In fact, I'd been reading parenting books and articles online, making sure I understood current safety guidelines. I wanted to be the best grandmother possible. "Plus," Aurora continued, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "she can barely take care of herself. Look at her. She's moving so slowly just picking up trash." The women giggled, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room focused on me as I continued gathering wrapping paper. My hands trembled slightly. Whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. I straightened up, the garbage bag clutched in my hands, and looked at Aurora. She was watching me with cold satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting for this moment to publicly establish the hierarchy between us. "I should probably get going," I said quietly. "Thank you for inviting me." "Actually, Martha, before you leave," Aurora stood up, her hand resting on her belly in a gesture that somehow seemed more possessive than protective. "I spilled some juice on the kitchen floor earlier. Could you mop that up? I'd do it myself, but you know, pregnant women shouldn't be bending over like that." The request hit me like a physical blow. She wanted me to mop her floor, in front of all these women, after I'd spent my afternoon serving them champagne and cleaning up after them like hired help. I walked to the kitchen in silence, found the mop in the utility closet, and filled a bucket with soapy water. The floor was barely dirty, just a few drops of what might have been orange juice near the refrigerator. But I mopped anyway, my movements mechanical, my mind spinning. When I returned to put the mop away, Aurora was opening what was clearly her favorite gift of the day, an elaborate swing that rocked the baby while playing classical music. The oohs and ahs from her audience were louder than they'd been for anything else. "This is absolutely perfect," Aurora gushed. "Little Prince is going to love this. He'll have the best of everything." I stood in the kitchen doorway, invisible again, watching my daughter-in-law bask in the attention and admiration of her friends. None of them looked in my direction. It was as if I'd ceased to exist the moment I'd finished my assigned cleaning tasks. "Martha," Aurora's voice cut through my thoughts. "Could you bring out those petit fours from the refrigerator and use the good plates, not the paper ones?" I served the delicate little cakes on Aurora's wedding china, careful not to chip anything. The women praised the catering company Aurora had chosen, discussing the various flavors and artistic decorations as if they were evaluating fine art. When the last petit four was gone, Aurora announced it was time for group photos. The women arranged themselves around her chair, some kneeling, others standing behind her, all of them beaming for the camera. Aurora's friend with the expensive camera took dozens of shots from different angles. "These are going to be beautiful," the photographer said, reviewing the images on her camera's screen. "Aurora, you look absolutely radiant." I remained in the kitchen watching through the doorway. Nobody suggested I join the photos. Nobody even seemed to remember I was there. The party began winding down around 4 o'clock. Women gathered their purses and offered final congratulations to Aurora, who accepted each compliment with gracious smiles and promises to send thank you notes. I started washing the china plates I'd used for the petit fours, wanting to make sure everything was clean before I left. "Martha." Aurora appeared in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed over her pregnant belly. "The living room needs to be put back together. The chairs need to go back where they belong, and someone needs to vacuum up all the crumbs." I looked past her at the living room, where at least 6 women were still chatting and taking final photos with their phones. "Of course, I'll take care of it," Good. And when you're done with that, the guest bathroom needs attention. People have been using it all afternoon. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Aurora watched me for a moment, then returned to her remaining guests. I finished the dishes, then began moving the rented chairs back to their original positions around the house. My back ached from all the bending and lifting, but I kept working. The last guests were finally saying their goodbyes when I started vacuuming the living room carpet. The sound of the vacuum cleaner mixed with Aurora's voice as she walked her friends to the door, thanking them for coming and promising to call soon. When the front door finally closed, the house fell silent except for the hum of the vacuum. I was bent over, trying to reach some crumbs that had fallen behind the couch, when I felt a sharp, stinging blow across my face. The slap was so unexpected, so shocking that I stumbled backward, dropping the vacuum handle. My hand flew to my cheek, which burned with pain and humiliation. Aurora stood over me, her face twisted with contempt. "You pathetic old woman! Look at you crawling around on the floor like some kind of servant. That's exactly what you are, isn't it? A useless old woman who can't do anything right." I stared at her, unable to speak, unable to process what had just happened. My daughter-in-law, the mother of my future grandchild, had just struck me. In her living room, after I'd spent the entire afternoon serving her and her friends. "You want to know the truth, Martha?" Aurora's voice was cold, vicious. "David doesn't even want you around the baby. We've talked about it. You're too old, too slow, too set in your outdated ways. This baby deserves better than some decrepit grandmother who doesn't know the first thing about modern parenting." The words cut deeper than the slap. I touched my cheek again, feeling the heat radiating from where her hand had connected. "Clean up this mess and get out," Aurora continued. "And don't expect to be invited to any more family events. You've embarrassed yourself enough for one day." She turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the living room with the overturned vacuum and the scattered remnants of what should have been a joyful celebration. I stood there for a long moment, my cheek throbbing, my heart racing. Then, with movements that felt strangely calm and deliberate, I turned off the vacuum, wound up the cord, and placed it back in the utility closet. I gathered my purse and car keys from where I'd left them on the kitchen counter. I didn't finish cleaning up. I didn't put the furniture back exactly where it belonged. I simply walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped outside into the late afternoon sunshine. But before I got in my car, I pulled out my cell phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. A number I hadn't called in over a year, but one I knew would still work. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Well, Martha Reynolds. This is a surprise. "Hello, Patricia," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I think it's time we had that conversation you've been wanting to have." The drive home from Aurora's house passed in a blur of stop signs and traffic lights. My cheek still stung where she'd slapped me, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation that sat like a stone in my chest. I kept replaying her words, the venom in her voice when she called me pathetic, useless. What Aurora didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand, was that I'd heard those exact words before. 35 years ago, from men in expensive suits who thought they could intimidate me into silence. Men who discovered, much to their regret, that they'd seriously underestimated Martha Reynolds. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot and sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the modest building I'd called home for the past 8 years. After David moved out and got married, I'd sold the family house and downsized. Aurora had made several snide comments about my tiny apartment, always followed by fake concern about whether I was managing okay financially. The truth was, I was managing better than okay. I was managing very well indeed. My apartment might be small, but it was paid for in full. So was my car. So were the investments I'd been quietly building for over 2 decades. Aurora assumed I was living on Social Security and whatever small pension I might have from my years as a secretary. She'd never bothered to ask about my actual career, and I'd never volunteered the information. Why would I? People revealed their true characters when they thought you had nothing to offer them. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, each step feeling heavier than usual. Inside, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite reading chair, the one David had helped me pick out when I first moved in. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the bookshelf that dominated one wall of my living room. Those books told a story Aurora would never expect: business management texts, human resources manuals, leadership development guides, books on negotiation, conflict resolution, and organizational psychology. Not exactly light reading for a retired secretary. But then again, I'd never been just a secretary. I pulled out my laptop, a machine Aurora probably assumed I used only for sending emails and looking at photos. She'd be shocked to know I maintained a LinkedIn profile with over 800 professional connections, or that I still received calls from former colleagues seeking advice on complex workplace situations. As the computer started up, I found myself thinking about Patricia Morrison, the woman I'd called from Aurora's driveway. Patricia had been trying to get me to come out of retirement for 3 years now, ever since she'd taken over as the regional director of human resources for a consortium of mid-sized companies throughout the state. "Martha, you know more about reading people than anyone I've ever worked with," she'd told me the last time we'd spoken. "These companies need someone who can see through the facades, spot the troublemakers before they cause real damage. You have a gift." I'd always deflected her offers, claiming I was enjoying my retirement too much to consider going back to work. The truth was more complicated. I'd left my career as Director of Human Resources at Hartwell Industries after 28 years because I was tired. Tired of the politics, the manipulation, the constant stream of people who thought they could charm or intimidate their way to success. I'd wanted peace, quiet, time to read novels instead of performance reviews, time to garden on my small balcony and knit baby blankets for the grandchild I'd hoped to spoil. But Aurora had just reminded me of something I'd temporarily forgotten. Sometimes peace isn't given, sometimes it has to be earned. I opened my email and began typing. "Dear Patricia, I've been reconsidering your offer. If the consulting position is still available, I'd like to discuss terms. I have some free time on my hands, and I think I'm ready to get back to doing what I do best. Best regards, Martha." I hit send before I could second-guess myself. While I waited for Patricia's response, I opened a different browser window and began the kind of research I'd once done for a living. Aurora Bennett, age 26, married to David Reynolds for 3 years. Previous employment history with Morrison Marketing Group, Stedman and Associates, and briefly with a small nonprofit called Community Outreach Partners. It took me less than 20 minutes to find what I was looking for. Morrison Marketing Group had been one of Patricia's client companies 2 years ago. I remembered her mentioning a particularly challenging case involving an employee who'd been dismissed for creating a hostile work environment. The employee had tried to sue for wrongful termination, claiming discrimination, but the case had been dismissed when evidence surfaced of her inappropriate behavior toward colleagues. The employee's name had been Aurora Bennett. I sat back in my chair, pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. Patricia would have the full file, of course. Employment records, witness statements, documentation of the incidents that led to Aurora's dismissal. Information that would paint a very different picture of my daughter-in-law than the one she'd carefully crafted for David and his friends. My phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia. "Martha, so excited to hear from you. Can we meet tomorrow morning? I have a situation that could really use your expertise. Also, I have some information you might find interesting about someone you know." I smiled for the first time since leaving Aurora's house. Patricia had always been perceptive. She'd probably connected the dots the moment she saw my email, remembering my last name and putting together that David Reynolds' wife was the same Aurora Bennett who'd caused so much trouble at Morrison Marketing. I texted back, 10 o'clock at our usual coffee shop. Perfect. And Martha? I think you're going to find this case particularly satisfying. I set my phone aside and walked to my bedroom, where I kept my professional wardrobe in the back of the closet. I hadn't worn a business suit in over a year, but I had a feeling I was going to need one very soon. The next morning, I arrived at Brewster's Coffee 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table where Patricia and I could speak privately. I'd chosen my navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to my retirement party. It still fit perfectly, and more importantly, It made me feel like the woman I'd been for nearly 3 decades, competent, authoritative, not someone you could slap and dismiss. Patricia arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather briefcase that meant she'd brought files. She'd aged well in the 5 years since my retirement, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that emphasized her intelligent gray eyes. We'd worked together on dozens of cases over the years, and I'd always respected her directness. "You look good, Martha," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Retirement agrees with you." "Actually, I think retirement might be overrated," I replied. "Tell me about this situation you mentioned." Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. 3 different companies in my consortium have reported similar problems over the past year. Employees who seemed perfect during the interview process, stellar references, impressive resumes, but within months of being hired, they've created toxic environments, harassment complaints, manipulative behavior, attempts to turn colleagues against management. She slid the folder across the table. The interesting thing is, these employees all have something in common. They're all highly skilled at presenting themselves as victims when they're confronted about their behavior. They claim discrimination, create sympathy among other employees, make themselves look like the wronged party. I opened the folder and began scanning the documents. 3 different companies, 3 different employees, but the patterns were strikingly similar. Charming interviews followed by gradual escalation of problematic behaviors, targeting of older employees or anyone they perceived as having influence, creation of workplace drama that distracted from productivity. "What do you need from me?" I asked, though I was already beginning to see the scope of the problem. "I need someone who can spot these manipulators before they're hired," Patricia said. "Someone who can see through the performance, ask the right questions, dig deeper into references. I need you to develop a screening process that protects these companies from hiring people who look perfect on paper but are actually toxic personalities." I nodded, understanding the challenge. In my years as an HR director, I'd encountered this type of employee before. They were often intelligent, attractive, and skilled at reading what people wanted to hear. They could be charming when it served their purposes, and ruthless when charm didn't work. "There's something else," Patricia continued, lowering her voice. "One of the employees I mentioned, the one at Morrison Marketing, her name was Aurora Bennett. I believe she's your daughter-in-law now." I met her gaze steadily. "Yes, she is. Martha, I can't share the specifics of her file without proper legal justification, but I can tell you that her departure from Morrison Marketing was contentious. Multiple complaints from female colleagues, inappropriate behavior toward supervisors, attempts to manipulate workplace relationships for personal gain." Patricia paused, studying my expression. "Is there something you need to tell me about why you're suddenly interested in coming back to work?" I considered my options. I could maintain my privacy, handle my family situation on my own, pretend that yesterday's humiliation was just a minor disagreement between relatives, or I could trust Patricia with the truth and see where it led. "Aurora slapped me yesterday," I said quietly, "at her baby shower, in front of a room full of women. Called me pathetic and useless, told me I wasn't fit to be around her baby." Patricia's expression hardened. "Physical assault is a crime, Martha. It's not about the slap," I said, though my cheek still felt tender when I touched it. "It's about the pattern. The way she's been systematically isolating me from my son, undermining my confidence, making me feel like I'm nothing more than an inconvenience in their lives." I looked down at the file in front of me, seeing my own situation reflected in the documented behaviors of Aurora's former colleagues. "I think my daughter-in-law is exactly the type of person you're trying to help companies avoid hiring," I continued. "And I think it's time someone did a proper background check on Aurora Bennett Reynolds." Patricia smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a woman who'd spent decades dealing with workplace bullies and knew exactly how to handle them. "Martha, I think your return to consulting is going to be more interesting than either of us expected." Patricia and I spent the rest of that morning laying out a plan that was both professional and deeply personal. She would provide me with access to Aurora's employment file from Morrison Marketing, along with the documentation from her other previous jobs. In exchange, I would help her develop the screening protocols she needed for her client companies. It was perfectly legitimate business. I was a consulting HR professional conducting research for a new assessment program. The fact that one of the case studies happened to be my daughter-in-law was simply a fortunate coincidence that would give me unique insight into the long-term effects of hiring toxic employees. By Thursday morning, I was sitting in Patricia's downtown office, a stack of files spread across the conference table between us. What I read in those documents made my stomach turn, but it also filled me with a cold, professional anger that I recognized from my years of dealing with workplace predators. Aurora's file from Morrison Marketing was particularly revealing. She'd been hired as a junior account coordinator, a position that required working closely with both clients and internal team members. Her interview had been flawless, glowing references from previous supervisors, a portfolio of marketing projects that demonstrated creativity and attention to detail. Even her appearance had been carefully calculated, professional but approachable, confident without being threatening. She knew exactly what to wear, what to say, how to position herself, Patricia noted, watching me read through the interview notes. Look at this comment from the hiring manager. Aurora seems like the perfect team player, eager to learn, respectful of authority, genuinely excited about contributing to our company culture. I turned the page and found the first incident report, dated just 6 weeks after Aurora's hire date. Janet Morrison, a senior account manager with 15 years at the company, had complained that Aurora was undermining her authority with clients. According to Janet's statement, Aurora had been making disparaging comments about Janet's age and outdated methods during client meetings. Janet was 52, Patricia said quietly, exactly your age when you were dealing with similar challenges in your own career. The pattern that emerged over the following months was sickeningly familiar. Aurora would identify the most vulnerable person in any workplace dynamic, usually someone older or less confident, and systematically work to undermine their credibility. She never did anything overtly hostile that could be easily documented. Instead, she used subtle manipulation, sighing dramatically when older colleagues spoke in meetings, making helpful suggestions that implied their incompetence, positioning herself as the young, fresh alternative to outdated thinking. Look at this, I said, pointing to a complaint filed by the office manager, a woman named Carol Hendricks. Aurora volunteered to help with the holiday party planning, then gradually took over the entire process. When Carol tried to maintain some control over the budget, Aurora told everyone that Carol was being difficult and controlling, that she was probably feeling threatened by younger employees. Patricia nodded grimly. Classic divide and conquer. Make the target look unreasonable while positioning yourself as the victim of their unfair treatment. The final incident at Morrison Marketing had involved sexual harassment allegations against Aurora's direct supervisor, a man named Robert Chen. According to the file, Aurora had complained that Robert was making inappropriate comments about her appearance and requesting after-hours meetings that made her uncomfortable. The investigation had initially supported Aurora's claims. Robert was placed on administrative leave while HR conducted interviews with other employees. But then the investigation took an unexpected turn. They found out Aurora had been recording conversations, Patricia explained. She'd been secretly documenting interactions with multiple supervisors, but when HR reviewed the recordings, they discovered she'd been editing them. Taking comments out of context, splicing together different conversations to create scenarios that had never actually happened. I felt sick reading the details. Aurora had destroyed Robert Chen's reputation and career with fabricated evidence. He'd resigned rather than fight the charges, even after the truth came out, because the damage to his professional standing was already done. What happened to Aurora? Terminated for falsifying evidence and creating a hostile work environment. But here's the thing, Martha. She was never prosecuted. Morrison Marketing wanted to avoid the publicity of admitting they'd nearly destroyed an innocent man's career based on her lies. They gave her a neutral reference and let her quietly disappear. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, processing what I'd learned. This wasn't just about workplace drama or personality conflicts. Aurora was a predator who used sophisticated manipulation techniques to destroy people who stood in her way. And now she was married to my son, about to become the mother of my grandchild. There's more, Patricia said, sliding another folder across the table. Her employment history before Morrison Marketing is equally problematic, though the documentation isn't as complete. She seems to have a pattern of staying at jobs just long enough to create maximum damage before moving on. I opened the second file and found records from Stedman and Associates, a small accounting firm where Aurora had worked as a receptionist for 8 months. The owner, Margaret Stedman, had provided a brief written statement about Aurora's departure. Employee displayed concerning behavior toward elderly clients, I read aloud. Repeatedly made inappropriate comments about their decision-making capacity and suggested they needed younger, more modern representation. When confronted about these incidents, employee became defensive and accused management of age discrimination. The pattern was consistent across every job. Aurora would target older employees or clients, undermine their confidence, and position herself as the superior alternative. When challenged, she would claim to be the victim of discrimination or unfair treatment. How did David not see this? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Because she's very good at what she does, Patricia replied. Look at the timeline. Aurora met your son just 3 months after leaving Morrison Marketing. She was probably looking for financial security and social status to rebuild her life. A successful man with an established career and family ties would have been perfect for her purposes. I thought about David's courtship with Aurora, how quickly it had progressed. She'd been everything he thought he wanted. Young, beautiful, attentive to his needs. She'd never shown any interest in my opinions or experiences, but David had interpreted that as simply being shy around his mother. He'd been charmed by her apparent vulnerability, her need for his protection and guidance. She isolated him from me gradually, I realized, speaking the words as the pattern became clear. First, it was just being too busy to visit as often, then suggestions that I was being too intrusive, that we needed to respect their privacy as a couple. By the time they got married, David genuinely believed that maintaining distance from me was healthy for their relationship. Patricia handed me a legal pad and pen. I want you to document every incident you can remember where Aurora displayed manipulative behavior toward you or others in your family. Dates, witnesses, specific comments. We're going to build a comprehensive profile. For the next 2 hours, I wrote down everything I could recall from the past 3 years. Aurora's subtle put-downs disguised as concern for my well-being. Her habit of scheduling family events when she knew I had other commitments, then expressing disappointment that I couldn't prioritize family time. The way she redirected conversations whenever I tried to share experiences or advice, making me feel like my input was unwelcome or irrelevant. She's been conditioning David to see me as a burden, I said as I finished writing. Every interaction she facilitated between us was designed to make me look needy, outdated, or intrusive. By the time of the baby shower, she felt confident enough to drop the pretense entirely. Patricia reviewed my notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting additional details. When she finished reading, she looked up at me with an expression I remembered from our most challenging cases. Martha, what Aurora did to you yesterday wasn't just personal cruelty. It was a public demonstration of power. She wanted those women to see her put you in your place, to establish herself as the unquestioned authority in your family dynamic. I nodded, understanding the implications. She's planning to use the baby as leverage to maintain that control. As long as David believes she's protecting their child from my negative influence, she can keep me marginalized indefinitely. Unless we change the narrative, Patricia said quietly. She opened her laptop and began typing. I'm going to send you contact information for 6 women who work at companies where Aurora previously applied for jobs but wasn't hired. They were all part of hiring committees that rejected her applications for various reasons. I watched her work, feeling a familiar surge of professional excitement. This was the part of HR work I'd always enjoyed most. The detective work, the careful assembly of evidence, the moment when patterns became clear and solutions emerged. What am I supposed to do with these contacts? Nothing unethical, Patricia assured me. You're conducting research for a consulting project on hiring best practices. These women agreed to participate in interviews about their decision-making processes. If Aurora's name happens to come up in the context of memorable candidates they chose not to hire, well, that's just valuable data for your research. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. Mom, Aurora mentioned you seemed upset when you left yesterday. Everything okay? I showed the message to Patricia, who smiled grimly. She's testing the waters, seeing if you're going to cause problems. How do you want to respond? I considered my options. The old Martha, the one who'd spent 3 years accepting Aurora's treatment because I didn't want to cause trouble for David, would have sent back something conciliatory. An apology for any misunderstanding, reassurance that everything was fine. But the professional Martha, the woman who'd spent decades identifying and neutralizing workplace threats, knew better. I typed back, "Just had some time to think about family dynamics. Looking forward to talking with you soon about the baby and what kind of grandmother role would work best for everyone." It was perfectly pleasant and completely non-threatening. It also let Aurora know that I wasn't going away quietly, that I had thoughts and opinions about my role in my grandchild's life that would need to be addressed. "Nicely done," Patricia said, reading over my shoulder. Polite, but firm. You're not accepting her dismissal, but you're not being confrontational either. I put my phone away and gathered up the files Patricia had shared with me. How long do you think it will take to complete the interviews? A week, maybe 2 if you want to be thorough. But Martha, I want you to be careful. Aurora is clearly skilled at manipulation, and if she realizes what you're doing, she might escalate her behavior. I thought about the sharp crack of Aurora's hand across my face, the venom in her voice as she called me pathetic and useless. I don't think she can escalate much further without revealing her true nature to David, and that's exactly what I'm counting on. Patricia walked me to the elevator, carrying herself with the confident stride I remembered from our years working together. You know, Martha, I've missed having you around. You always were the best at seeing through people's facades. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished metal. For the first time in months, I looked like myself again. Not the marginalized grandmother Aurora had tried to turn me into, but the competent professional I'd always been. Aurora had made a serious mistake yesterday. She'd assumed I was powerless, that I would accept her humiliation and disappear quietly from their lives. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. The first interview was scheduled for Monday morning at a small cafe downtown. Linda Carson had been the HR director at Fletcher & Associates when Aurora applied for a marketing position 18 months ago. According to Patricia's notes, Aurora had made it to the final round of interviews before being eliminated from consideration. I arrived early and chose a corner table, just as I had with Patricia. Linda was exactly on time, a woman in her early 50s with the kind of professional demeanor that came from years of evaluating job candidates and making difficult personnel decisions. "Mrs. Reynolds, thank you for including me in your research project," she said as she settled into her chair with a cup of coffee. "Patricia mentioned you're developing new screening protocols for identifying problematic employees." "That's right. I'm particularly interested in candidates who present well during interviews but may have underlying behavioral issues that only surface after hiring." I pulled out my legal pad, maintaining the pretense of conducting general research. "Patricia mentioned you had some candidates who fit that profile." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "We've definitely learned to look beyond surface impressions. There was one candidate last year who was absolutely perfect on paper. Stellar resume, excellent references, charming personality, but something about her interview responses bothered me. What specifically concerned you? She was almost too polished," Linda said, choosing her words carefully. Every answer was perfectly crafted, like she'd rehearsed responses to common interview questions. But when I asked her about challenging workplace situations she'd handled, her examples were all about conflicts with older colleagues who supposedly couldn't adapt to modern business practices. I felt a familiar chill of recognition. Did she provide specific examples? Oh yes, very detailed stories. A supervisor who was resistant to new technology. A coworker who was stuck in outdated methods and couldn't handle constructive feedback. The way she described these conflicts, she was always the reasonable one trying to help stubborn older employees modernize their approach. Linda paused to sip her coffee, then continued. What bothered me was the pattern. Every challenging situation she described involved someone significantly older than herself, and in every case, she positioned herself as the solution to their inadequacy. I made notes on my pad, though I could have recited Aurora's tactics from memory by now. How did you handle the situation? I called her references, of course, but I also did something we don't usually do. I reached out to some of the people she'd mentioned in her examples, not to violate confidentiality, but to get a sense of the workplace culture at her previous employers. This was interesting. Most hiring managers stopped at the provided references, trusting that previous employers would give honest assessments. Linda had gone deeper. What did you discover? The woman she'd described as a resistant supervisor was actually a 25-year veteran with an excellent reputation for mentoring younger employees. When I spoke with her former colleagues, they painted a very different picture of the workplace conflicts our candidate had described. Linda leaned forward, lowering her voice even though we were in a public place. According to multiple sources, this candidate had systematically undermined the older supervisor's authority, questioned her decisions in front of clients, and made disparaging comments about her age and competence. The supervisor had actually filed complaints about the candidate's behavior before ultimately requesting a transfer to a different department. I felt my anger building again, the same cold fury I'd experienced reading Aurora's employment files. Did you confront the candidate about these discrepancies? I brought her back for a final interview and asked some pointed questions about her version of events. She became very defensive, claimed that older employees often gang up on younger workers when they feel threatened by change. She actually suggested that my questions indicated bias against younger candidates. The manipulation was textbook Aurora. When caught in lies or inconsistencies, she immediately shifted to claiming victimhood and accusing others of discrimination. Obviously, we didn't hire her, Linda continued. But the experience taught me to be much more thorough in checking references, especially when candidates' stories seem too convenient or consistently position them as the reasonable party in workplace conflicts. I thanked Linda for her time and moved on to my next interview, scheduled for that afternoon. The pattern repeated itself with disturbing consistency. Sarah Mitchell from Consolidated Services had a similar story about Aurora's interview process, including the same red flags about conflicts with older colleagues and the same defensive response when questioned about specifics. By the end of the week, I'd spoken with all 6 women Patricia had identified. Every single one had recognized the warning signs that David, blinded by Aurora's charm and apparent vulnerability, had missed entirely. More importantly, I now had a network of professional contacts who understood exactly what kind of person Aurora was. Women who had seen through her manipulation and had the documentation to prove their concerns were valid. Friday afternoon, I called Patricia to report my findings. You were right about the pattern being consistent, I told her. Aurora has been using the same tactics for years, targeting older employees and supervisors, then claiming discrimination when she's called out for her behavior. How are you feeling about everything you've learned? Patricia asked. I considered the question carefully. A week ago, I would have said I felt devastated, betrayed by my daughter-in-law's cruelty and my son's failure to protect me. But now, armed with evidence of Aurora's true nature, I felt something different. I feel vindicated, I said honestly, and I feel powerful. For the first time in 3 years, I understand what I've been dealing with. What's your next move? That was the question I'd been pondering all week. I had the evidence I needed to expose Aurora's pattern of behavior, but I also had to consider the collateral damage. David loved his wife, or at least loved the person he thought she was. He was about to become a father, excited about starting his family. Even if I could prove Aurora's manipulative nature, would David thank me for destroying his marriage and his vision of his future? I think I need to let Aurora make the next move, I said finally. She's gotten away with her behavior for so long because her victims have either been isolated or intimidated into silence. But I'm not isolated anymore, and I'm definitely not intimidated. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Martha, be careful. Cornered predators can be dangerous. I understood her concern, but I also knew something Aurora didn't. I wasn't the helpless grandmother she'd been conditioning David to see. I was a professional with decades of experience dealing with toxic personalities, and now I had a network of allies who understood the threat she represented. The test came sooner than expected. Saturday evening, David called to invite me to dinner Sunday night. Aurora thought it would be nice to have a family meal before the baby comes, he said, his tone suggesting this had been Aurora's idea rather than his own. That sounds lovely, I replied, though I knew this was no peace offering. Aurora had spent the week testing whether I would cause problems after the baby shower incident. My carefully neutral responses had apparently convinced her that I needed to be brought back under control. Great. Aurora's really looking forward to it. She mentioned she might have been a little stressed at the baby shower with all the excitement and everything. You know how pregnancy hormones can be. There it was. Aurora had already begun rewriting history, turning her calculated cruelty into a minor misunderstanding caused by pregnancy stress. David had bought the explanation completely, probably relieved to have a simple reason for the tension he'd sensed between us. Of course, I said. Pregnancy can be overwhelming. I'm sure everything will be fine. Sunday evening, I arrived at David and Aurora's house at exactly 6 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine and a small gift bag. This time, I hadn't spent weeks knitting something special. This time, I'd chosen my gift very carefully from a boutique baby store. Aurora greeted me at the door with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Martha, so good to see you. Come in, come in." She was wearing a flowing maternity dress that emphasized her pregnant belly, her hair styled in soft waves that made her look younger and more vulnerable than usual. The performance was carefully calculated to remind me of her protected status as David's pregnant wife. "You look lovely, Aurora," I said, handing her the wine, "and I brought a little something for the baby." She accepted the gift bag with apparent delight, pulling out the tissue paper to reveal a silver picture frame engraved with baby's first photo. It was elegant, expensive, and completely impersonal. "Oh, how thoughtful," Aurora said, though I could see the confusion in her eyes. She'd been expecting something handmade, something personal that she could dismiss or criticize. The professional gift gave her no opening for subtle insults. David appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Mom, perfect timing. Dinner's almost ready." "Us?" He hugged me warmly, and I felt a pang of sadness at how genuinely happy he seemed. Whatever else Aurora was, she'd made him feel loved and valued. I had to remember that any action I took would affect his happiness, not just hers. Over dinner, Aurora played the role of gracious hostess perfectly. She asked about my week, complimented my outfit, and shared updates about her pregnancy with appropriate excitement. To anyone watching, we looked like a normal family, having a pleasant meal together. But I was watching her more carefully now, seeing the calculation behind every gesture. The way she positioned herself physically between David and me. The subtle redirections whenever I tried to contribute to conversations about the baby or family plans. The practiced expressions of concern when she asked about my health or my little apartment. "Martha, David and I have been talking about childcare arrangements," Aurora said as we finished the main course. "Since you've mentioned wanting to help with the baby, we thought we should discuss what that might look like." Here it came, the real purpose of this dinner. "We've decided it would be best to start with very limited visits," Aurora continued, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "Maybe an hour or two once a month, always with one of us present, of course, just until we establish our routines and make sure the baby is adjusting well to family interactions." David nodded along, clearly believing this was a reasonable compromise. "We want to make sure everyone's comfortable, especially in those first few months when babies are so fragile. 1 hour, once a month, with supervision." Aurora was offering me the role of distant acquaintance rather than grandmother, wrapped in language that made it sound like she was being generous. A month ago, I would have accepted these terms gratefully, thankful for any access to my grandchild. Tonight, I simply smiled and nodded. "That sounds very thoughtful." You're right that establishing routines is important for new parents. Aurora's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd expected me to argue, to plead for more time, to give her an excuse to reduce the offer even further. My calm acceptance wasn't the reaction she'd planned for. Of course, if you're not comfortable with those arrangements, we understand, she added, probing for a different response. Not at all, I said pleasantly. You're the parents. These decisions are entirely up to you. David looked relieved at my cooperative attitude. Aurora looked frustrated. After dinner, as David cleared the dishes, Aurora followed me into the living room under the pretense of showing me the nursery preparations. The moment we were alone, her mask slipped. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Martha, she said quietly, her voice lacking the warmth she'd displayed all evening. But don't think I don't see through your little act. I turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean. You've been different this week. The texts, the phone calls, the way you're behaving tonight. You're planning something, and I want you to know that whatever it is, it won't work. For a moment, I was tempted to lay my cards on the table, to tell her exactly what I'd learned about her employment history, her pattern of manipulation, her systematic destruction of other people's careers and reputations, to let her know that I was no longer the isolated, powerless woman she'd been tormenting for 3 years. Instead, I smiled. Aurora, I think pregnancy really is affecting your judgment. I'm just trying to be a good grandmother. Her jaw tightened. Stay in your lane, Martha. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Actually, I said softly, I think I'm beginning to understand exactly what you're capable of. The question is whether you understand what I'm capable of. David's voice called from the kitchen, asking if we wanted coffee, breaking the tension between us. Aurora immediately resumed her pleasant expression, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She'd spent 3 years believing I was weak, isolated, and easy to control. Tonight, for the first time, she'd encountered evidence that her assessment might be wrong. As I drove home, I realized that Aurora would now see me as a threat rather than just an annoyance. She would start planning more aggressive moves to neutralize my influence with David. That was exactly what I was counting on, because the more desperate Aurora became, the more likely she was to reveal her true nature to the one person whose opinion really mattered. My son was about to see his wife's mask slip, and when it did, I would be ready. Aurora's escalation came exactly 2 weeks after our tense dinner conversation. It started with a phone call from David on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with concern. Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over tonight after work? The formal tone was unlike him. David had always been casual with me, calling me during lunch breaks just to chat or stopping by my apartment unannounced on weekends. This felt different. Official. Of course, sweetheart. Is everything all right? We'll discuss it when you get here, he said, then hung up without his usual goodbye. I spent the day mentally preparing for whatever Aurora had planned. She'd had 2 weeks to strategize since our confrontation, 2 weeks to convince David that I posed some kind of threat to their family. The question was what story she'd crafted and how much David would believe. I arrived at their house at 7 o'clock sharp, noting immediately that Aurora's car wasn't in the driveway. David answered the door alone, his expression serious but not unkind. Come in, Mom. Aurora's at her book club so we can talk privately. This surprised me. I'd expected Aurora to orchestrate whatever conversation David wanted to have, to be present to control the narrative and guide his responses. Her absence suggested either tremendous confidence in her manipulation or a different strategy entirely. David led me to the living room, where 2 cups of coffee waited on the table. He'd always been thoughtful that way, anticipating needs and trying to make difficult conversations easier. Mom, I need to ask you about something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. I settled into the armchair across from him, noting his body language. Tense but not hostile, confused rather than angry. Whatever Aurora had told him, he hadn't entirely bought it. Of course, David, you can ask me anything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be text messages. Aurora showed me some messages she's been receiving from people who know you. Messages about your professional reputation. My stomach dropped. Aurora had somehow discovered my consulting work with Patricia But how? And what exactly did she think she'd learned? What kind of messages? I asked carefully. David read from his phone. Your mother-in-law has been asking questions about Aurora's employment history. She's been interviewing people who worked with Aurora at previous jobs, trying to dig up dirt. You should know that Martha is spreading rumors about Aurora being a problem employee. The message was unsigned, but I recognized the manipulation immediately. Aurora had created fake contacts, probably using burner email accounts or temporary phone numbers, to send David anonymous warnings about my activities. It was a sophisticated approach that played on his protective instincts while making me look like the aggressor. David, I can explain. There's more, he interrupted, reading another message. Martha is working with some HR consultant to build a case against Aurora. She's been lying about conducting research when she's really trying to sabotage Aurora's reputation. You need to protect your family from her interference. I sat in silence, impressed despite myself by Aurora's strategy. She'd taken the truth of my consulting work and twisted it into evidence of malicious intent. The facts were accurate enough that I couldn't simply deny them, but the context had been completely distorted. Mom, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you haven't been investigating my wife behind our backs. The pain in his voice was genuine. David felt betrayed, not just by my actions, but by the possibility that his mother and wife couldn't coexist peacefully in his life. I had a choice to make. I could deny Aurora's allegations, stick to the cover story about general research, and hope David would believe me over anonymous messages. Or I could tell him the truth and risk destroying his marriage and his happiness. David, I need you to listen to me very carefully, I said, making my decision. Yes, I have been learning about Aurora's employment history, but not for the reasons those messages suggest. His face fell. Mom, how could you? Because she slapped me, I said quietly. At the baby shower, in front of 20 women, your wife struck me across the face and called me pathetic and useless. David's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, he looked like the confused little boy he'd been when his father left, trying to make sense of adult behavior that didn't match what he'd been told. That's not. Aurora said you had an argument about childcare arrangements. She said you became upset when she asked you to respect their parenting decisions. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recording app I'd started using after my meeting with Patricia. It was a habit I'd developed during my HR years, a way to protect myself in difficult conversations. David, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened that day, and then I'm going to show you why it matters. But first, I need you to promise me that you'll listen to everything before you make any judgments. For the next hour, I walked David through the events of the baby shower. The way Aurora had treated me like hired help, the escalating humiliation, the physical assault that followed. I explained about my professional background, my consulting work with Patricia, and the employment records that painted a picture of systematic workplace manipulation. David listened in silence, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern to something approaching horror as I laid out the evidence. These documents show that Aurora has a pattern, I concluded, spreading Patricia's files across the coffee table. She targets older employees, undermines their confidence, creates hostile work environments, and then claims to be the victim when she's confronted about her behavior. David picked up one of the files, scanning the incident reports from Morrison Marketing. This says she falsified evidence to file sexual harassment claims against her supervisor. She destroyed an innocent man's career, David, and when the truth came out, she moved on to her next job and started the pattern all over again. I watched my son process this information, seeing the moment when professional knowledge overtook emotional denial. David was an engineer, trained to analyze systems and identify flaws. The documentation I'd provided painted a clear picture of systematic predatory behavior. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked finally. "Because I hoped I was wrong. Because I wanted to believe that marriage had changed her, that becoming a mother would bring out better qualities. Because I love you, and I didn't want to destroy your happiness based on suspicions." David set down the file and looked at me with eyes that held too much new knowledge. "What changed your mind?" "The slap. The public humiliation. The The realization that she was planning to use your baby as a weapon to keep me marginalized in your life? I paused, letting him absorb the implications. David, everything she's done to me, she's done to other people. The only difference is that I have the resources and professional connections to fight back. We sat in silence for several minutes while David absorbed what he'd learned. I could see him replaying conversations, re-examining interactions, recognizing manipulation techniques he'd previously interpreted as normal relationship dynamics. The messages, he said suddenly. The anonymous warnings about your activities. She sent those to herself, didn't she? I nodded. It's a classic technique. Create external validation for your victim narrative while making your target look like the aggressor. David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression darkened. She's asking if I've talked to you yet about the situation. She wants to know if you've admitted to trying to sabotage her. What are you going to tell her? David looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his expression that reminded me of the determined little boy who'd once stood up to schoolyard bullies. I'm going to tell her that we need to have a very different conversation than the one she's expecting. As if summoned by our discussion, we heard Aurora's car in the driveway. David quickly gathered up the files I'd brought, handing them back to me. Put these away, he said quietly. I want to see how she handles this without knowing what I've learned. Aurora entered the house with her usual bright energy, calling out greetings as she hung up her coat. When she appeared in the living room, her smile faltered slightly at the serious atmosphere. How did it go? She asked David, settling beside him on the couch with practiced intimacy. Did Martha explain why she's been trying to cause problems for our family? David's response was careful, measured. We talked about the situation. I think there are some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up. Aurora's eyes sharpened. What kind of misunderstandings? Well, for example, David said casually, Mom mentioned that you had some kind of physical altercation at the baby shower, but you told me it was just a disagreement about childcare. I watched Aurora's face carefully, seeing the micro-expressions that most people would miss. The brief flash of panic, quickly covered by practiced confusion. Physical altercation? Aurora laughed, but the sound was forced. David, your mother is being dramatic. We had words, yes, but nothing physical happened. Maybe she's having memory issues? Older people sometimes confuse or exaggerate situations. There it was. The casual ageism, the subtle suggestion that my mental capacity was declining, the positioning of herself as the reliable narrator while implying I was delusional. David nodded slowly. That's interesting, because Mom was very specific about what happened. She said you slapped her. Aurora's performance was flawless. Her mouth opened in shock, her hand flying to her chest in apparent dismay. That's a terrible accusation. David, you know me. You know I would never lay a hand on anyone, especially not your mother. She turned to me with tears forming in her eyes. Martha, I can't believe you would say something like that. Why would you tell David such a horrible lie? If I hadn't spent the past month learning about Aurora's history, her performance would have been completely convincing. The hurt confusion, the wounded innocence, the implied disappointment that I would fabricate such a serious allegation. But I had learned about her history. I knew exactly how skilled she was at playing the victim. I'm not lying, Aurora, I said calmly. You slapped me in your living room after calling me pathetic and useless. It happened right after you made me mop your kitchen floor in front of your guests. Aurora's tears flowed more freely now. David, this is exactly what I was worried about. Your mother is clearly having some kind of breakdown. First, she's secretly investigating me like I'm some kind of criminal. And now she's making up stories about physical violence. She reached for David's hand, her voice breaking with apparent emotion. I'm scared, honey. What if she does something to hurt the baby? What if whatever's happening to her mentally makes her dangerous? It was a masterful escalation. Aurora had taken my accusations and flipped them back on me, suggesting that I was mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to their unborn child. She was forcing David to choose between protecting his pregnant wife or believing his supposedly delusional mother. David looked between us, and for a moment, I feared Aurora's performance had been too convincing. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. Aurora, where did you work before Morrison Marketing? The question came out of nowhere, at least from Aurora's perspective. She blinked, clearly caught off guard by the change of subject. What does that have to do with anything? Just curious about your career history. We've been married 3 years, and I realize I don't know much about your previous jobs. Aurora's confusion was genuine now. She didn't understand why David was asking about her employment history when they were supposed to be discussing my alleged mental breakdown. I worked at Stedman and Associates, she said slowly. Before that, community outreach partners. David, why are we talking about my old jobs? What was Margaret Stedman like as a boss? Now Aurora looked genuinely unsettled. The conversation had veered completely away from the script she'd prepared. She was difficult, very old-fashioned in her management style, not very welcoming to younger employees with fresh ideas. David nodded thoughtfully. Did you have any problems with other older employees at these jobs? And there it was, the moment when Aurora realized that David knew far more than she'd anticipated. Her careful composure cracked, just slightly, but enough for someone watching closely to notice. I don't understand what you're trying to imply, she said, her voice developing an edge. David stood up slowly, his decision made. I think you understand exactly what I'm implying, and I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who you really are. The mask was finally falling, and Aurora knew it. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed in my decades of professional experience dealing with toxic personalities. When cornered, Aurora didn't just drop her mask, she shattered it completely. You want honesty, David. Aurora's voice transformed from wounded innocence to cold fury in seconds. Fine. Yes, I slapped your pathetic mother. She deserved it. She's been undermining me since the day we met, trying to turn you against me with her needy, manipulative behavior. David stepped backward, actually physically recoiling from the venom in his wife's voice. This was a woman he'd never seen before, someone whose existence he couldn't have imagined. Aurora, what are you saying? I'm saying your mother is a bitter old woman who can't stand that you chose me over her. She's been playing the victim for 3 years, making me look like the bad guy every time I try to establish normal boundaries in our marriage. I remained silent, letting Aurora's true nature speak for itself. This was exactly what Patricia had warned me about. Cornered predators become dangerous, but they also become honest about their motivations. And yes, I looked into her little investigation project. Did you really think I wouldn't find out that she's been digging through my employment records, trying to find dirt on me? She's obsessed with proving I'm not good enough for you. David's engineer's mind was processing the contradictions in real time. But Aurora, if Mom was wrong about your employment history, why are you so angry? Why not just show me the truth? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Aurora's face cycled through several expressions before settling on defiant rage. Because the truth doesn't matter. Your mother has already poisoned your mind against me. She's been planning this for months, probably since the day she found out I was pregnant. She can't stand that our baby will be more important to you than she is. It was a fascinating display of projection. Aurora was describing her own motivations, her inability to tolerate sharing David's attention, while attributing them to me. Aurora, David said slowly, I need you to tell me about Morrison Marketing, about Robert Chen. The name hit Aurora like a physical blow. Her face went white, then flushed with anger. How do you know that name? Mom showed me the employment files, the investigation records. Aurora, did you falsify evidence to destroy an innocent man's career? For a moment, I thought Aurora might try to continue lying. But something in David's expression, perhaps the complete absence of his usual protective warmth, told her that denial was no longer an option. Robert Chen was a sexist pig who didn't deserve his position, she said, her voice shaking with rage. He looked down on younger employees, dismissed my ideas, treated me like I was invisible. He got exactly what he deserved. Aurora, the investigation proved you edited recordings to make false accusations. I showed them the truth of what he was really like. So what if I had to? Enhance the evidence? Men like him have been getting away with discrimination for decades. David sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. You destroyed his life with lies. I exposed his true character. The fact that I had to manufacture specific evidence doesn't change the underlying reality of who he was. The rationalization was breathtaking. Aurora had convinced herself that her lies were justified because they supported a larger truth she believed in. It was the mindset of every manipulator I'd ever encountered. The rules didn't apply to them because their cause was righteous. David looked at me, his expression full of pain and confusion. Mom, how long have you known about this? I started investigating after the baby shower, I said gently. I needed to understand whether what happened to me was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. And what did you find? I glanced at Aurora, who was watching me with undisguised hatred. I found that your wife has spent years targeting older employees, undermining their confidence, and destroying their reputations when they stood up to her. The baby shower wasn't an aberration. It was Aurora showing me who she really is. Aurora laughed, but the sound was bitter and harsh. You want to talk about patterns? Let's talk about your pattern, Martha. 3 years of inserting yourself into our relationship, making snide comments about how we live our lives, acting like you know better than us about everything. Give me one example, I said calmly. Every time you visited, you rearranged something in my kitchen. Every time we went out to dinner, you found something to criticize about the restaurant or the service. Every conversation we had, you managed to work in some story about how things were different when David was growing up. I realized with startling clarity that Aurora had genuinely interpreted normal grandmotherly behavior as attacks on her authority. My attempts to be helpful had been seen as territorial challenges. My stories about David's childhood had been perceived as attempts to undermine her position as his wife. Aurora, I was trying to build a relationship with you. I wanted us to be family. You wanted to control me, Aurora shot back. Just like you controlled David his whole life. You couldn't stand that he found someone who actually appreciated him for who he is, not who you wanted him to be. David's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but firm. Aurora, that's not true. Mom never tried to control me. She supported every decision I made, even when she disagreed with them. Including marrying me? Aurora's voice was sharp with challenge. David hesitated, and in that moment of silence, Aurora saw her opening. You see? She never wanted us together. She's been planning to break us up since day one, and now she's using my pregnancy as an excuse to destroy our marriage. But David's hesitation wasn't about doubt. It was about choosing his words carefully. Aurora, I would have defended you against anyone who tried to interfere in our marriage. But what Mom showed me tonight, these aren't opinions or personality conflicts. These are documented facts about how you've treated other people. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. I keep thinking about all the times you told me stories about difficult coworkers or unreasonable supervisors. How every job you left was because of someone else's problems. Never anything you did wrong. Aurora's face was pale now, understanding that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. I also keep thinking about how you described Mom to me over the years. How you gradually convinced me that she was needy, intrusive, unable to respect boundaries. How I started seeing her attempts to be involved in our lives as selfish demands for attention. David turned back to face his wife, and I could see the man he'd become. Not the charmed husband Aurora had been manipulating, but someone who'd finally recognized the truth. You isolated me from my mother the same way you isolated other people from their support systems at work. The techniques are identical. Aurora's composure finally shattered completely. Fine. Yes, I made sure your mother knew her place. Yes, I protected our marriage from her interference. But everything I did was for us, David. For our family. No, David said quietly. Everything you did was for you. To maintain control. To eliminate any challenge to your authority. To make sure everyone around you served your needs. Aurora's hand moved to her pregnant belly, a gesture I recognized as her final play for sympathy. David, please. Think about our baby. Think about our family. Don't let her destroy everything we've built together. But David had moved beyond the reach of Aurora's manipulation. I am thinking about our baby. I'm thinking about what kind of mother you'll be if this is who you really are. I'm thinking about whether I want my child growing up in a home where cruelty is disguised as protection. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Aurora looked between David and me, understanding finally that she had lost control of the situation entirely. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Both of you will regret this." David's response was calm, final. "Aurora, I think you should stay at your sister's house tonight. We both need time to think about what happens next." After Aurora left, David and I sat in his living room in exhausted silence. The confrontation had drained us both, but underneath the weariness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years: peace. "I'm sorry, Mom," David said finally. "I should have seen what was happening." "Sweetheart, Aurora is very skilled at what she does. She had years of practice manipulating workplace dynamics before she met you. You couldn't have known, but I should have protected you. I should have questioned why you seemed to disappear from our lives after I got married." I reached over and took his hand, feeling the connection that Aurora had tried so hard to sever. "You were protecting your wife and your marriage. That's what good husbands do. You couldn't have known that your wife was the threat your family needed protection from." David was quiet for a long moment. "What happens now?" "That depends on Aurora, and on what you decide you can live with." 3 months later, David filed for divorce. Aurora fought it viciously at first, then tried to negotiate a settlement that would give her primary custody of the baby in exchange for reduced financial support. When that failed, she attempted to claim that David was emotionally abusive, that I had turned him against her through manipulation and lies. But Patricia had helped David document everything properly. Aurora's employment history, her pattern of manipulation, the evidence of her systematic targeting of older employees, all of it became part of the court record. Aurora's attempts to paint herself as the victim fell flat when faced with decades of documented predatory behavior. The baby was born on a Thursday morning in early spring. David called me from the hospital, his voice shaking with emotion. "Mom, can you come meet your grandson?" I held baby Thomas for the first time in a quiet hospital room. Just David and me, and this perfect little person who would never know the toxic environment his mother had tried to create around him. Aurora had moved back to her hometown after the divorce was finalized. Accepting supervised visitation rather than continuing to fight for custody, she was unlikely to win. "He looks like you did as a baby," I told David, who was taking what felt like hundreds of photos on his phone. "Aurora said I was never allowed to compare him to our family," David said quietly. "She said he was going to be better than that he'd have advantages we never had." I looked at my grandson's tiny fingers wrapped around my thumb, thinking about the advantages he would actually have. He would grow up knowing unconditional love. He would never be used as a weapon in adult conflicts. He would be taught to treat others with respect and kindness. "He's going to have the best advantage of all," I said. "He's going to have a father who learned the difference between love and control." 6 months after Thomas's birth, Patricia offered me a permanent position developing anti-harassment training programs for her client companies. I accepted, finding unexpected joy in returning to work that felt meaningful and important. I also started volunteering with a support group for older adults who'd experienced family manipulation and emotional abuse. There were more of us than I'd ever imagined: grandparents who'd been systematically isolated from their families, retirees who'd been convinced they were burdens rather than valuable family members. But that's another story. This story ends with a grandmother who reclaimed her power, a son who learned to recognize manipulation, and a baby who will grow up in a home where love doesn't come with conditions or require submission. Aurora taught me something valuable, though I doubt she intended to. She showed me that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who reveal our hidden strengths. Sometimes being pushed to our breaking point is exactly what we need to remember who we really are. I am Martha Reynolds. I am 61 years old. I am a grandmother, a professional, and a woman who refuses to be diminished by anyone's small vision of who I should be. And Aurora Bennett will never have power over me again. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.